But hey, there are many people that do have a problem with mask mandates. There's a whole trucker convoy
Here in our capital city, families and small businesses have been enduring.
This is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau talking about the emergency powers that he's using to quell the protests.
Illegal obstruction of their neighborhoods, occupying streets, harassing people, breaking the law. This is not a peaceful protest. At the borders in different parts of the country, the blockades are harming our economy and endangering public safety. Critical supply chains have been disrupted. This is hurting workers who rely on these jobs to feed their families. Despite their best efforts, it is now clear that there are serious challenges to law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law. Today, to continue building on these efforts, the federal government is ready to use more tools at its disposal.
Did you see my football graphics last night?
Fully under control. After discussing with Cabinet and caucus, after consultation with premiers from all provinces and territories, after speaking with opposition leaders, the federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear. The scope of these measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address. The Emergencies Act will be used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels across the country.
We'll talk about the halftime show here in a little bit.
Safe, protecting people's jobs, and restoring confidence in our institutions.
Heard Trudeau say that these are not peaceful protests, but, Dan Bongino says that they are being mischaracterized.
But they're being mischaracterized, these truckers. What can we expect from them, and what can we expect from this convoy in the United States if it happens, and what's the real objective here?
Well, again, March 5th.
And they keep threatening a convoy here in the U.S. Supposedly it was going to come to the Super Bowl last night. Never fucking happened. Supposedly it's going to descend on D.C. for Biden's State of the Union address, which is coming up in about 2 weeks.
We're going to gather in Coachella Valley for an all-day event. March 6th, we'll send off the truckers. They will travel east, headed toward Washington, D.C., and it's going to be entirely peaceful. It's going to be a gathering that will gain momentum as it proceeds, and I think it's going to be a gathering that's going to be supported by millions of Americans who come out to, literally make sandwiches for the truck drivers, who come out as they did in Canada with shows of solidarity and support at the roadside. And of course, our goal is to demonstrate and to be together in a way that, as we did in Washington, D.C. last month, is entirely peaceful, is entirely focused on our common life together as Americans and healing this culture that these forces are trying to divide.
Yeah.
The truckers that work aren't participating in this. These are owner-operators that are throwing a fucking hissy fit. And let's see what kind of people they actually are. Canadian police arrest 11 people with massive weapons cache.
RCMP say they have arrested and detained 11 people connected with the blockade. There, we've got the CBC's Hillary Johnstone tracking the very latest. So, Hillary, take us through what we know.
Well, Andrew, RCMP in Alberta say that they became aware of a small organized group within that larger Coutts border protest, border blockade, that had weapons, ammunition, and that seemed to indicate that if police were to try and move in and end that blockade, that they might be willing to act. So as a result of all of this, and we've heard from Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney that this investigation has been ongoing for a number of days now. But as a result of all of this, they have arrested and detained 11 people. Want to just go through a little bit of what was seized, some of these items. 13 long guns, handguns, multiple sets of body armor, a machete, a large quantity of ammunition, and high-capacity magazines. So we understand from the RCMP that they went in and they executed a search warrant in the early hours of this morning, early Monday morning. I want to play a little bit now as well of some of what we've heard from Alberta's Premier, Jason Kenney, in response to all of this.
Those who have been impatient about enforcement, I ask them to understand that this investigation has been ongoing over the past week, and the RCMP obviously did not want to escalate the situation that could provoke potential violence until they had a tactical plan in place at the appropriate time to take enforcement action and to seize these weapons, as they've done early this morning.
So RCMP have been indicating that they had intelligence, had information that suggested that some of these people in this group were willing to use force against the police if they were to move in and try and disrupt that blockade. Here's a little bit more. I want to read a little bit more of what the police are saying about this group. So, quote, an example of the militant mindset of a small segment of the protest earlier in the evening at approximately 8 p.m.
Now, I've seen conflicting reports about whether the police are supporting them or not.
The blockade attempted to ram a police vehicle. The police officer was able to reposition and avoid the collision. It goes on to say that police followed the suspects to a location where the protesters were gathered. The driver of the tractor was identified, and we are actively working to locate him so he can be taken into custody. So just to give you a little bit more of a sense of what the police are saying right now, we just heard there from the Premier, from Jason Kenney. He also went on to say that what has been happening at that Coutts border will no longer be tolerated. He called this investigation and what we have just learned about these arrests a delicate security challenge. He also went on to say that his message to anyone who is still at that Coutts border, that all you've done is inconvenience thousands of hardworking truckers, who've been forced to travel further to try and get around this blockade in the past couple of weeks, and also saying that what we have just learned underscores the severity of what has been happening.
So these are privileged assholes being funded by right-wing billionaires, the same motherfuckers that are funding COVID misinformation. It's just more unrest being fueled by assholes. Anytime you see a narrative being pushed by all these right-wing outlets, with Fox, with all the usual suspects, the Daily Wire and shit, amplifying the message, be fucking leery of it. Blockade at the Canadian border begins to clear after police enforcement. This was from yesterday, or 2 days ago, I'm sorry. On my notes for yesterday's show, the blockade at the U.S.-Canadian border was beginning to dissolve on Saturday, but some protesters still remain after police moved in to try to remove the vaccine mandate protesters. The police intervention was the strongest escalation by authorities after truckers, farmers, and other protesters have blocked roads and portions of the busiest U.S.-Canada border crossing for days, cutting off key delivery routes and leading factories to shut down. The police cleared most of the demonstrators away from the Ambassador Bridge on Saturday morning, while about a dozen vehicles remained, according to the New York Times. Anytime you've got Jordan Peterson on your side, you need to really examine what you're doing. Peterson has a message for the truckers.
I've been asked to say a few words to the truckers in Ottawa, and so I've given that some careful consideration. All you protesters, you've accomplished an awful lot already. You know, the Conservative leadership has crumbled, and Aaron O'Toole has been replaced by someone who is giving a fair bit of voice to your concerns. You now have a voice in the House of Commons. All the people you represent have a voice in the House of Commons. You have 4 provinces that have moved quite precipitously in the direction that the protest was hoping for.
Well, no one asked me to talk either, and I just do it. So
something approximating as reasonable a timeline as might be expected under the circumstances. You're now faced with a difficult choice, which is, what are your criteria for satisfaction? You need to determine that, and so that you can negotiate with the necessary people. You're also faced with the danger at the moment.
And mandates now.
the political process bends in the direction that you've insisted upon so rightly, in my estimation, more and more of you who are most reasonable are going to pack up and leave or decide that this is done sometime over the next week or so, or a couple of weeks.
The galaxy
Obviously up to
brain.
you. But there'll be a remnant that's much more committed in some sense to more extreme goals, and that's going to be something very difficult to manage. I'd like to commend all of you for your diligence and work on accomplishing what you have accomplished.
What have they accomplished?
Trying conditions, and also for keeping your heads in a way that's actually been a model for the entire world. The fact that you've been able to remain peaceful, you haven't taken the bait, you haven't responded with violence to quite remarkable.
They have harassed homeless shelters. They have annoyed the residents by honking and banging gas cans. They had a weapons cache that had to be confiscated.
Denigration and provocation, that's a sign of tremendous discipline and care. It's going to get more difficult to maintain as this goes along. So I hope that you're all in this position to allow a sufficient victory to be sufficient.
They want freedom.
Rancor, to be grateful for the effect that you've already had and the support that you've received, and to move forward to a normative peace and the reestablishment of our country's economy and our psychological and social well-being.
He said fucking nothing. Ginger, you're right. He made absolutely no sense. He never does. I don't understand why people take him seriously, but he's a self-help guru. Makes a shit ton of money, and even his daughter's gotten in on it. Beef daughter. And I saw her bitching about TEDx or some shit earlier. Let's talk about the propaganda of them calling themselves the Freedom Convoy. An article from the CBC, why the word freedom is such a useful rallying cry for the protesters. Just like how all fascists co-opt the language of popular movements. Just like here in the U.S., they appeal to the Constitution. I'm a constitutionalist. They've never fucking read the Constitution. It's the same thing. They make these appeals to things that they're not actually fighting for. The word has become common among far-right groups, experts say, yes. Just like patriot. I think I cost myself a job the other day because the dude, I guess he thought the flag behind me was a Gadsden flag. He's like, oh, you're a patriot, which I try to remember to take it down before I have video conferences with clients. Said, oh, you're a patriot. Sure, okay. These people aren't patriots. Demonstrations against COVID-19 restrictions continue across Canada. The word freedom is on the lips and placards of many protesters. Often associated with protests and rallies in the United States, the term has taken hold among protesters who are part of the Freedom Convoy, which rolled into Ottawa in late January and has become entrenched in the city's downtown. For many, freedom is a malleable term, one that's open to interpretation. Flexibility, in part, has fueled its growth among certain groups, said Barbara Perry, director of the Center on Hate, Bias and Extremism at the Oshawa-based Ontario Tech University. It's a term that has resonated. You can define it and understand it and sort of manipulate it in a way that makes sense to you and is useful to you depending on your perspective. It's also a term that has thrived among far-right groups, said Perry, one of a number of experts who say the presence of far-right groups in Canada is growing. As seen among some protesters currently opposing vaccine mandates and other public health measures, freedom signals are a desire for freedom from government intervention or overreach, Perry noted. I think it resonates very much with what we've been seeing and maybe take some inspiration from what we've been seeing in the U.S. over the last year and a half or so, leading up to the last election and events of January 6th, she said, referring to the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Protesters have gridlocked the streets of Ottawa with tractor-trailers and personal vehicles for 16 days as part of what they call the Freedom Convoy. Similar protests have sprung up across Canada in the wake of the ongoing demonstration in the nation's capital, including at international border crossings in Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. Convoy protesters are calling for an end to all vaccine mandates as well as other pandemic-related restrictions. Canada Unity, one of the main organizing groups behind the protests, says on its website it is committing to upholding freedom of choice for Canadians. Evan Balgord, executive director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, says the way many protesters frame their calls for freedom renders the word meaningless. And what they're really asking for is a shift in government policy that could potentially have a negative impact on others. They're yelling they care so much about their freedom, they're taking freedoms away from other people who don't have the same kind of agency and choice that they do. And we're going to see that when we talk about the Loudoun County Board here in just a second. We're going to see the groups that are for mask mandates versus the groups that are against mask mandates. And these people aren't speaking for the little people. Yes, Gabe, we are live. What's going on? The concept of freedom can be used to reject equality. To see the word freedom bandied about as part of these protests points to a broader circulation of what Elizabeth Anker calls violent forms of freedom. Freedom is a slippery concept, said Anker, an associate professor of political science at George Washington University and author of Ugly Freedoms, which examines the history of how freedom as a concept has been used in American society. On the far right, individual freedom is often translated into somebody who refuses to be bound by norms of equality, treating all people equally, or norms to remedy inequality, whether that's trying to remedy racial discrimination or gender discrimination. The word has been used by far-right groups as part of a pushback against efforts to remedy inequality. While those forms of violent freedom can result in situations that are dangerous, discriminatory, or anti-democratic, the call to action can gain broader support because fighting for freedom is seen as a noble cause. Right groups began appearing in Canada back in 2015, and in the years since, Perry says that anti-state rhetoric has gained more mainstream popularity. Now, freedom leads social media posts about the protest is trumpeted in memes and even the focus of merchandise. A bumper sticker that reads "Mandate Freedom" emblazoned with a maple leaf is available for sale online, so are t-shirts and hats promoting the Freedom Convoy. You see that all over far-right Facebook. Boy, howdy, do they have t-shirts and everything, a lot of 1776 merchandise, a lot of freedom merchandise,